Dr. Carl Clauberg was a German medical doctor who experimented on living human beings during World War II. He decided to go into the field of medicine after being an infantryman in World War I. In 1942, after being a medical doctor for some time, Clauberg asked Heinrich Himmler, who was intrigued in Clauberg's research, to allow him to sterilize people. He was granted his request, and after working on his experiments in the Birkenau concentration camp, was transferred to Auschwitz, where he began his medical experimentation in one of the blocks. Carl Clauberg was involved in horrific experiments aimed at the goal of sterilizing the patient. One of these experiments involved injecting women with toxic chemicals in order to destroy the patient's ovaries. This was done under the false notion that they were going in for a gynecological examination. The patient would be injected with a special chemical irritant, causing acute inflammation resulting in sterilization. Another major experiment consisted of exposing the patients, both men and women, to large amounts of radiation to sterilize them. These experiments, besides the intended effect of sterilization, caused terrible suffering. The injection experiments caused extreme internal damage to the patients and inflamed ovaries in women. His radiation experiments caused massive radiation burns and excruciating pain. After all of his experiments, the patients were usually not fit to return to work, therefore they were killed. Afterwards, their reproductive organs were shipped away in order to be further studied. Carl Clauberg sterilized over 700 women throughout his experimentation. Clauberg's experiments were not met with much resistance by the general community because they were not well known to the public. This was part of the larger German scheme to keep what was going on in the concentration camp secret. When the Russian army approached Auschwitz, Carl Clauberg escaped and traveled to Ravensbrück concentration camp to continue with his experiments. The people that survived his experiments thought of Carl Clauberg not as a doctor, but a monster. These people eventually formed survivor groups who were to speak out against Clauberg. In 1948, after the war, he was sentenced to 25 years in prison by the Soviet Union as a punishment for his crimes. After only 7 years, he was released due to the returnee agreement between Bonn and Moscow. He then traveled to West Germany, where he immediately held a press conference where he boasted about his scientific experiments. This led to an uproar by survivor groups, and therefore he was again arrested. Carl Clauberg died in August of 1957, just before his trial commenced. Carl Clauberg performed horrific experiments which left survivors permanently scarred, both physically and emotionally. By today's standards, Carl Clauberg was not punished enough and should have probably faced life in prison or worse. One lesson that can be taken from his experiments is the fact that human experimentation is absolutely wrong and should never be repeated.